It was the day before Thanksgiving, 1971. A cold, damp dusk was settling over the Pacific Northwest. At Portland International Airport, passengers moved through the low-slung terminal, a place of ashtrays, vinyl seats, and the low hum of anticipation before a holiday. Among them was a man in his mid-40s. He wore a dark suit, a white shirt, a black tie, and a conservative overcoat. He carried a black attaché case. He purchased a one-way ticket for cash, $20.76 for Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305. The flight was a short hop, just 30 minutes in the air from Portland to Seattle. It was a routine journey, the kind flown by businessmen and travelers eager to get home for the holiday. The man gave his name as Dan Cooper. He boarded the Boeing 727, tail number N467 US, and took seat 18C, a window seat in the rear of the aircraft. The flight was only about a third full with 36 passengers and a crew of 6. It pushed back from the gate at 2:50 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. As the plane climbed into the gray November sky, flight attendants began their service. One of them, a young woman named Florence Schaffner, moved down the aisle. When she passed row 18, the man in the dark suit caught her attention. He handed her a white envelope. It seemed like a note from a passenger hoping to arrange a date, a not uncommon occurrence. Schaffner somewhat dismissively slipped it into her pocket without looking. The man leaned closer. His voice was calm, even. "Miss," he said, "you'd better look at that note. I have a bomb." Schaffner retrieved the envelope. Inside was a message block printed in neat felt-tip pen. It stated the man had a bomb in his attaché case. He wanted her to sit beside him. She did. He opened the case just enough for her to see a glimpse of what was inside, a collection of red cylindrical sticks, wires, and a large battery. It looked convincingly like a bomb. The note made his demand $200,000 in cash, all in $20 bills. It also demanded 4 parachutes, 2 primary back chutes, and 2 emergency chest chutes. He wanted them in Seattle upon landing. When the money and parachutes were delivered, he would release the passengers. He would keep the crew. He told Schaffner to relay this information to the captain. He was polite, he was composed, he did not raise his voice. He ordered a bourbon and soda and he paid for it. In the cockpit, Captain William Scott received the news. He immediately contacted Seattle-Tacoma Airport Air Traffic Control and Northwest Orient Airlines. The company's president was notified. The FBI was alerted. A critical decision was made. Comply. There was no negotiation on the demands. The goal was to get the plane on the ground safely. The airline and the FBI began a frantic scramble. They assembled the ransom money, $10,020 bills, unmarked, but their serial numbers were quietly recorded. They gathered the parachutes from a local skydiving school exactly to the hijackers' specifications. All of this was happening as Flight 305 droned northward, circling Puget Sound in a holding pattern, burning fuel to buy time. Back in the cabin, the other passengers remained largely unaware. The hijacker, Dan Cooper, was not causing a scene. He sat quietly with Florence Schaffner. At one point, he allowed her to go forward to speak with the captain, instructing her to return. He repeated his instructions calmly. The crew worked to maintain normalcy. They informed the passengers of a minor mechanical difficulty to explain the delay. Cooper was not wearing sunglasses. He allowed the window shade to remain open. He was seen clearly by the flight attendants. He was, in their words, quiet, courteous, and familiar with the local terrain, commenting on landmarks they passed. He appeared to be about 5'10", 170 pounds, with brown eyes and a swarthy complexion. He was, in every observable way, ordinary. Meanwhile, on the ground in Seattle, a surreal scene was unfolding. The airport was put on emergency status. The plane was instructed to land on a remote runway away from the terminal. Law enforcement and airline officials watched as the 727 touched down at 5:39 p.m. It was now dark. Cooper instructed the crew that no one was to approach the aircraft. A vehicle was permitted to bring a set of air stairs to the rear door. An airline employee, following Cooper's precise instructions, brought the money in a knapsack and the 4 parachutes to the foot of the stairs. A flight attendant, Tina Mucklow, opened the rear door, retrieved the knapsack and chutes, and handed them to Cooper. He inspected the contents carefully. He kept the money. He allowed the parachutes to be taken into the cabin for examination. With the ransom delivered, Cooper was true to his word. He permitted all 36 passengers and two of the flight attendants, Florence Schaffner and Alice Hancock, to leave the plane via the forward stairs. They descended into the cool night air, bewildered but unharmed, and were bussed to the terminal. On board, only 4 people remained: Captain William Scott, First Officer Bob Radixak, Flight Engineer H.E. Anderson, and Stewardess Tina Mucklow. Cooper had a new set of instructions. He wanted the plane refueled. He gave detailed, precise orders for their next destination. He wanted to fly to Mexico City, and he wanted the flight flown according to his very specific technical parameters. The rear stairs were to remain lowered during takeoff and flight. The wing flaps were to be set at 15 degrees. The landing gear was to remain down. The cabin was to remain unpressurized. The airspeed was not to exceed 170 knots. He warned them not to try anything. He made clear, wearing one of the parachutes. The bomb was within reach. The crew knew these were not the demands of a madman. They were the calculated requirements of someone who knew airplanes. The Boeing 727 was unique for its time. It had a rear air stair that could be lowered in flight, a feature designed for quick airport turnarounds. Cooper's flight parameters would make the aircraft slow, low, and manageable for a jump. He had done his homework. As ground crews refueled the plane under the watchful eyes of snipers and FBI agents, Cooper sat in the back with Tina Mucklow. He was calm. He helped her put on a parachute, ostensibly to show her how it worked. He asked her about the operation of the rear stair. He remained courteous. At 7:40 p.m., with refueling complete, the strange, modified jet prepared for takeoff. Its rear stair gaped open into the blackness. Dan Cooper, $200,000 in a knapsack, and 4 parachutes were in the back. The crew was sealed in the cockpit. Their orders were to fly south toward the vast, dark wilderness of the Pacific Northwest. No one knew what would happen next. The Boeing 727, with its rear stairway gaping open like a wound, thundered down the runway at Seattle-Tacoma Airport. It was a bizarre and unprecedented sight. Inside the cockpit, the crew followed Cooper's instructions to the letter. Flaps at 15 degrees, landing gear down, cabin unpressurized, airspeed no more than 170 knots. The plane lifted heavily, sluggishly into the rainy night sky. It turned south, heading for the Oregon border. Their stated destination was Mexico City, but everyone on board and everyone listening on the ground knew that was unlikely to be the final stop. In the cabin, the environment was harsh. With the rear door open, a deafening roar of wind and engines filled the aircraft. The temperature plummeted. Outside, the November night was a frigid 35 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind chill from the open door made it far worse. Tina Mucklow, the sole flight attendant with Cooper, was instructed to go to the cockpit and stay there. She joined the 3 pilots, closing the heavy cockpit door behind her. From this point forward, Dan Cooper was alone in the rear of the passenger cabin with his money, his parachutes, and his bomb. The crew's orders were specific. They were to fly at 10,000 feet, a relatively low altitude made necessary by the lack of cabin pressure. They were to keep the airplane in a slow, shallow descent. The cockpit warning lights indicated the rear stair was deployed, a constant electronic reminder of the extraordinary situation. The crew had little to do but monitor their instruments and wait. They could not see Cooper. They could only hear him on the interphone, his voice still calm, still in control. He requested they turn on a cabin light so he could see. They complied. Around 8:00 p.m., a warning light illuminated on the engineering panel. It indicated a change in air pressure, suggesting something had shifted in the aft of the plane. The crew believed it might be the rear stair being manipulated. Shortly after, at approximately 8:13 p.m., the aircraft experienced a slight, distinct bump. It felt, the crew later reported, like a shift in weight and balance. First Officer Bob Radixak commented that it felt like someone had jumped off the rear stairs. Almost immediately, the plane seemed to fly more smoothly. The pilots looked at each other. They waited. For 20 minutes, they heard nothing from the cabin. The silence was more unnerving than the previous calm instructions. Finally, Captain Scott used the interphone. "Is there anything we can do for you?" he asked. There was no response. He tried again, nothing. With extreme caution, using the aircraft's public address system, he announced they would be coming out of the cockpit. He received only silence. He instructed Tina Mucklow to lock the cockpit door from the inside. Then Captain Scott and First Officer Radixak slowly, nervously exited the cockpit and moved into the empty passenger cabin. The scene was empty. Wind whipped through the open rear stairwell. The noise was overwhelming. They moved down the aisle checking rows. The plane was vacant. Dan Cooper was gone, so was the knapsack with the $200,000. Two of the four parachutes were also missing, one primary and one emergency chest chute. The other two parachutes remained neatly packed. His black attaché case, tie, and mother-of-pearl tie clip were found on a seat. The bomb was gone, presumably taken with him. The hijacker had vanished into the night sky over some of the most rugged, forested terrain in the United States. The pilots immediately radioed the news to air traffic control. The FBI was notified. The flight was diverted to Reno, Nevada for a safe landing. When the plane touched down, a swarm of law enforcement agents descended upon it. The investigation began within minutes. The cabin was secured. The remaining parachutes, the attaché case, every surface was treated as evidence. The crew was extensively debriefed. They provided a detailed physical description and confirmed the timeline. The jump had occurred somewhere between Portland and Reno, in a corridor over southwestern Washington state. The hunt for Dan Cooper had begun, but they were not searching for a man on the ground. They were searching for a ghost who had vanished into thin air. On the ground in the homes and businesses of the Pacific Northwest, people were just beginning to hear sketchy news reports about a hijacking in Seattle. The full incredible details, the parachutes, the jump, the missing hijacker were not yet public, but law enforcement was already grappling with the staggering implications. A man had successfully hijacked an airplane, secured a ransom, and then escaped by parachute. It was an unprecedented crime. The FBI assumed he was likely dead. The conditions for a parachute jump were appalling. A dark, stormy night over mountainous, heavily forested terrain in near-freezing temperatures, wearing a business suit and street shoes. The chances of survival, let alone a successful escape, seemed remote, but they had to operate on the assumption he was alive. The serial numbers of the $20 bills were distributed to banks across the country. Agents began to scour the possible drop zone. The public learned the hijacker's name from early news reports, D.B. Cooper. This was an error. A wire service reporter hearing the FBI was investigating a suspect named Dan Cooper mistakenly rendered it as D.B. Cooper. The name stuck. It became iconic, but the real Dan Cooper, the name he gave at the ticket counter, was a dead end. The FBI checked every Dan Cooper they could find, none were their man. The name was almost certainly an alias, plucked from the air, perhaps inspired by a popular Belgian comic book series about a jet-setting Canadian pilot named Dan Cooper. The hijacker had left no real name, no fingerprints on the plane that could be identified, and no clear path to follow. All investigators had was a description, a pile of money with recorded serial numbers, and a vast, impenetrable wilderness. The crew's description painted a picture of an unremarkable man. White male, mid-40s, about 5'10" to 6 feet tall, 170 to 180 pounds. Close-set brown eyes, a swarthy or olive complexion. He wore a black clip-on tie. He smoked Raleigh cigarettes. He was polite, calm, and knowledgeable. He did not seem nervous. He seemed like a planner. The fact that he knew about the 727's rear stair capability and knew the precise flight configurations needed to make a jump possible suggested he had aviation or military experience. Possibly a paratrooper, possibly an aircraft engineer. He was no amateur. But who was he? A disgruntled employee, a thrill seeker, a criminal genius? Or simply a quiet, desperate man who saw a chance at a fortune and took it, gambling his life on a freezing jump into the unknown? As FBI agents fanned out and the news broke in the morning papers, the legend of D.B. Cooper was born. He was no longer just a hijacker. He was a figure of mystery, a man who had outsmarted the system and vanished. And somewhere in the cold, dark woods of the Pacific Northwest, or perhaps in a quiet suburb with a new identity, he was either a corpse or a very rich man. The search was on. The search for D.B. Cooper began in darkness and chaos. The FBI's first and most pressing task was to define where exactly he had jumped. Based on the crew's account of the bump and their flight path, investigators plotted a probable drop zone. It was a massive, vague area encompassing thousands of square miles of southwestern Washington state. The terrain was a nightmare of dense, old-growth forest, steep ravines, swollen rivers, and rugged foothills leading to the Cascade Mountains. The search would be like looking for a single specific needle in a haystack the size of a small state, and it was November. The weather was cold, wet, and unforgiving. Almost immediately, the FBI made a critical and public assumption: Cooper was dead. They believed no one could have survived that jump under those conditions. The official focus, therefore, was on recovering a body, the parachutes, and the money. They coordinated with local law enforcement, the Civil Air Patrol, and the U.S. military. Aircraft crisscrossed the skies, looking for any sign of a downed parachute or disturbance in the endless green canopy below. Ground teams, including experienced woodsmen and search and rescue units, were deployed along roads and riverbanks. They found nothing. No torn parachute silk caught in the trees, no disturbed undergrowth, no body. The public, however, was captivated by a different idea: that Cooper had survived. The image of a lone man leaping into a stormy night with a bag full of cash was the stuff of legend. It tapped into a deep, almost romantic American archetype: the outlaw who beats the system. The FBI's pronouncements of his probable death did little to dampen this fascination. If anything, it fueled speculation. If he was dead, where was the evidence? The forests were vast, but surely a body or a bright parachute would eventually be found by a hunter or a hiker. The lack of any physical trace began to suggest to a hopeful public a brilliant success. The investigation turned to forensics. The items left on the plane were subjected to intense scrutiny. The black attaché case yielded no fingerprints. The clip-on tie and the mother-of-pearl tie clip were examined. The tie was a common brand sold in many department stores. On it, investigators found minuscule particles of rare metals, titanium and stainless steel. This suggested a possible link to the aerospace industry, which was prominent in the Seattle area, but it was a thin lead. The parachutes were examined by experts. Cooper had taken the two that were professionally packed by the skydiving school. He left behind the two that had been hastily packed by the Seattle Police Department, which he had inspected and deemed unsatisfactory. This choice indicated a working knowledge of parachutes. He knew what to look for. He knew which packs were trustworthy. Then there was the money. 10,000 $20 bills, their serial numbers recorded. The FBI flooded banks, businesses, and casinos across the country with the list. They believed the ransom would eventually surface. If Cooper was alive and spent even a single bill, it would trigger an alert and give them a location. Agents waited. The list circulated for years. Not one of those 10,000 bills ever appeared in routine banking transactions. This was a profound mystery. If Cooper was dead, the money was presumably with his body, rotting in the woods. If he was alive and had spent it, how had he managed to launder $200,000 in small bills without a single one being caught? It seemed almost as impossible as the jump itself. As the official ground and air searches wound down without result, the case grew cold. But the public refused to let it go. Tips poured into the FBI field office in Seattle. People reported seeing suspicious men matching Cooper's description in bars, airports, and bus stations. Others claimed to have found parachute straps in their backyards. Every supposed sighting had to be checked. Every piece of debris had to be examined. The vast majority were dead ends, products of overactive imaginations or the desire for attention. The FBI fielded thousands of leads, a drain on resources for a case that was, in their view, likely a recovery operation rather than a manhunt. One of the first serious suspects emerged from within the plane's own passenger manifest. The FBI investigated every person on Flight 305. They were all cleared. Then in 1972, a man named Richard Floyd McCoy suddenly came to the forefront. McCoy was an experienced paratrooper, a skilled pilot, and a Mormon Sunday school teacher. In April of 1972, just 5 months after the Cooper hijacking, he pulled off a nearly identical crime. He hijacked a Boeing 727 over Utah, demanded a ransom of $500,000, and parachuted from the rear stairs. He was captured days later, convicted, and eventually killed in a shootout during an escape attempt. The similarities were striking. The FBI seriously considered McCoy as a suspect for D.B. Cooper. He fit the profile perfectly. But there were problems. McCoy was taller and younger than the description of Cooper. Flight attendants from the Cooper hijacking were shown McCoy's photo. They did not identify him as their hijacker. While the modus operandi was eerily similar, the evidence did not conclusively link McCoy to the earlier crime. He remained a compelling theory but not a solution. The lack of a body or any spent ransom money created a vacuum. Into that vacuum flowed theories, each trying to solve the puzzle of Cooper's fate. The simplest theory was that he died on impact. The jump was at 10,000 feet into a freezing windstorm. He was wearing street clothes and loafers. He could have been knocked unconscious upon exiting the stairwell, his parachute failing to deploy. He could have landed in the deep, cold waters of the Lewis River or Lake Merwin and drowned. The forests were so dense that a body could lie undiscovered for decades, consumed by animals and the elements. This was and remains the most statistically likely scenario according to law enforcement and survival experts. But the legend demanded a survivor, and so other theories took root. Perhaps he had an accomplice waiting on the ground with a car landing in a pre-arranged clearing. Perhaps he buried the money and lived quietly, spending it in tiny, untraceable amounts over many years. Perhaps he changed his identity and moved abroad. The complete absence of the bills in circulation, however, argued against this. Unless the money was destroyed or sat in a hiding place forever, it should have surfaced. The fact that it never did was one of the most confounding elements of the entire case. It was the lock on a door for which no one could find the key. By the mid-1970s, the active, large-scale search for D.B. Cooper was over. The FBI maintained an open file, assigning agents to follow up on promising leads, but the investigation had entered a new phase. It was no longer a frantic manhunt. It was a waiting game. They were waiting for a body to be found. They were waiting for money to appear. They were waiting for a deathbed confession. In the quiet of the FBI office, the case was a frustrating puzzle. In the public mind, however, D.B. Cooper was already becoming something else. A folk hero, a symbol of audacious escape and America's only perfect crime. The FBI's investigation into the D.B. Cooper case stretched across decades, becoming the longest and most extensive air piracy investigation in American history. The file never closed. New agents were assigned to it as older ones retired, each inheriting a legend along with a stack of paperwork. The approach was methodical, driven by forensics and tip analysis, yet perpetually hampered by the sheer lack of physical evidence. Over the years, a few tantalizing pieces of the puzzle seemed to fall into place, only to create new questions. The first major break, or what seemed like one, came in 1980. 8 years after the hijacking, a young boy named Brian Ingram was on a family camping trip along the Columbia River near the small town of Vancouver, Washington. He was digging a fire pit in the sandy riverbank when his fingers struck something soft and rubbery. It was a package of decaying $20 bills. He pulled it out and then found more. In total, he unearthed $5,800 of the Cooper ransom money, 290 bills. The serial numbers matched. The money was waterlogged and broken down, but it was unmistakably part of the hoard given to the hijacker. The discovery sent a shockwave through the investigation. It proved definitively that at least some of the money had not been burned or hidden away in a safe deposit box. It had entered the environment. The location was critically important. The Columbia River site was not within the FBI's original primary search zone. It was farther west downstream. This suggested new possibilities. Perhaps Cooper had landed near a tributary of the Columbia and the money had washed into the river system over time. Perhaps he had buried the cash near the riverbank and erosion had exposed it. Forensic analysis of the money showed no signs of having been buried for years. The deterioration was consistent with exposure to river water and elements. The leading theory became that the money had entered the river shortly after the hijacking, either because Cooper landed in the water and the bag broke open, or because he dumped it in a panic. This find revitalized the search. The FBI and local volunteers combed the area. They found nothing else. No parachute shreds, no clothing, no body. The money was a ghostly signpost pointing to a conclusion that remained just out of reach. It supported the theory that Cooper had not survived. If he had landed safely and kept the money, why would nearly $6,000 end up decomposing in a riverbank? The logical conclusion was that the ransom had been scattered by natural forces from a point of impact. Yet it also created a puzzle. If he died on impact, why was only a fraction of the money found? Where was the rest? And where was he? The investigation into possible suspects never stopped. The FBI compiled a list of hundreds of persons of interest over the years. Each had some element that connected them to the case: aviation experience, parachuting skill, a resemblance to the sketch, or suspicious behavior after 1971. One of the most thoroughly investigated was a man named Kenneth Christiansen. He was a former World War II paratrooper who later worked for Northwest Orient Airlines as a flight attendant and purser. He knew the Boeing 727 intimately. He lived in the Pacific Northwest, bore a resemblance to the composite sketch, and was known to be dissatisfied with his financial situation. He also smoked the same brand of cigarettes as Cooper. After his death, his family found a large amount of cash in his home. He was a compelling suspect, but definitive proof linking him to the crime was never established. Another suspect was Robert Rackstraw, an ex-Army paratrooper and pilot with a checkered past. He came to the FBI's attention in the late 1970s. He matched the physical description and had advanced parachuting skills. He also had a history of forgery and fraud. Decades later, a team of private investigators featured in a television documentary named him as their prime suspect, citing military records and circumstantial evidence. The FBI, however, never found enough to charge him. Rackstraw himself denied any involvement, and the evidence against him remained largely circumstantial and speculative. Then there was the theory of the experienced skydiver. This theory posited that Cooper was not just a former paratrooper, but an active, expert skydiver. He knew to demand civilian parachutes, not military ones, because he knew they had ripcords he could control. He knew to reject the poorly packed police chutes. An expert might have had a chance of surviving that terrible jump, especially if he planned a landing in a body of water to cushion the impact. This theory attempts to explain the survival possibility, but it still collides with the fate of the money found in the river. The FBI also had to contend with a parade of confessors. Over the years, several individuals claimed to be D.B. Cooper. Some were clearly mentally ill. Others were seeking notoriety. One of the most persistent was a man named John List, who had murdered his family in 1971 and was on the run for years. He was suggested as a suspect due to the timeline, but he bore no resemblance to the composite sketch and had no parachuting background. Each confession was meticulously checked against the known facts. None held up. The real Cooper, if alive, never came forward. By the early 2000s, scientific advances offered new hope. The FBI re-examined the physical evidence using technology that didn't exist in 1971. They performed DNA testing on the clip-on tie left on the plane, hoping to find a genetic profile. They recovered a few partial DNA sequences, but they were incomplete and degraded. They could not be conclusively matched to anyone. The tie clip and the parachutes were re-analyzed. No smoking gun emerged. The evidence was too old, too contaminated, or too sparse. The central dilemma of the investigation remained unresolved. The evidence pointed in two irreconcilable directions. On one hand, the riverbank money suggested a fatal jump, with the ransom scattered by nature. On the other hand, the absolute lack of any other physical trace, no body, no parachute, no clothing, after decades of people traversing every inch of those woods was strange. Hunters, loggers, hikers, and surveyors had covered that ground. It was not the surface of the moon. People found things. The fact that they found only a disintegrating packet of bills was, in its own way, as mysterious as finding nothing at all. In 2016, the FBI officially suspended active investigation into the case, citing the need to prioritize other, more solvable crimes. They transferred the responsibility for any future leads to the local field office, effectively acknowledging that after 45 years, the trail was beyond cold. They stated their belief that Cooper did not survive the jump. Yet they also admitted the case was littered with unanswered questions. The suspension was not a closure. It was an admission of a stalemate. Theories about Cooper's fate, therefore, are not built on new evidence but on interpretations of the old. The death in the jump theory is the official stance. He landed in the forest or a river and perished. The elements and animals disposed of the body. The money bag broke and most of it is still out there, dissolved or buried under silt. The survival and escape theory persists against the odds, suggesting a masterful plan executed by a professional who lived to enjoy his money, perhaps abroad. The death, but not on impact theory suggests he survived the landing but succumbed to exposure or injury in the woods, dying in a location so remote his remains have never been found. This last theory might explain the lack of a body while still accounting for the riverbank money. Perhaps he tried to follow a river to civilization, losing the cash along the way. Each theory has its flaws. Death on impact doesn't fully explain the lack of parachute debris. Survival doesn't explain the complete absence of the money in circulation. The investigation exhausted every lead, chased every suspect, and employed every forensic tool available. It reached the outer limits of what facts could provide. What remains is a constellation of possibilities, orbiting around a single dark point in the night sky over Washington state where a man stepped off an airplane and into legend. D.B. Cooper did not just vanish from the skies over Washington. He vanished into the American psyche. What began as a daring, desperate crime transformed into a modern folk tale, a story stripped of its criminal menace and recast as a symbol of rebellion and ingenious escape. In the decades since that rainy night in 1971, the man has been overshadowed by the myth. The unresolved ending was not a failure of narrative. It was the essential ingredient that allowed the legend to grow. The public fascination was immediate and enduring. In the 1970s, a nation grappling with Vietnam, Watergate, and economic stagnation found in Cooper an unlikely anti-hero. He wasn't protesting a war or exposing corruption, but he was striking a blow against a faceless system. He was the little guy using his wits to beat the airlines and the FBI. He didn't hurt anyone, a point emphasized repeatedly. The crew described him as polite. The passengers were released unharmed. This was crucial. It allowed people to root for him without the moral burden of violence. He became the gentleman bandit, a figure from an older American tradition like a jet-age Jesse James. This fascination manifested in strange and tangible ways. D.B. Cooper became a brand. There were songs, movies, and television episodes inspired by the case. T-shirts bore his composite sketch. The term copycat entered the lexicon of air piracy because of the hijackings that followed, most notably by Richard McCoy. In the small towns near the presumed drop zone, the legend became local folklore. Every year around Thanksgiving, the story was retold in bars and newspapers. Cooper Days festivals sprung up in Ariel, Washington, featuring parachute demonstrations and look-alike contests. For some, it was a tourist gimmick. For others, it was a celebration of a mystery that put their corner of the woods on the map. The unsolved nature of the case created a unique space for amateur sleuths. Before the internet, they traded theories via newsletters and books. With the dawn of the digital age, Cooper forums and websites became hubs for intense speculation. Hobbyists pored over flight maps, weather reports, and parachute manuals. They used modern mapping software to plot new possible landing zones. Some organized their own searches, scouring ravines with metal detectors. They debated the merits of various suspects with the fervor of scholars analyzing a religious text. This communal investigation was driven by a shared desire to solve a puzzle that the authorities could not. It was a cold case democratized. The impact on aviation security was direct and profound. The Cooper hijacking exposed a glaring vulnerability. The FAA mandated that all Boeing 727 aircraft be fitted with a simple device called a Cooper vane, a mechanical aerodynamic lock that prevented the rear air stairs from being lowered in flight. This made the specific method of escape impossible to repeat. More broadly, the case accelerated the move toward universal passenger screening. The era of walking onto a plane with a briefcase that potentially contained a bomb without passing through a metal detector or having your luggage X-rayed was ending. D.B. Cooper, in a way, helped usher in the modern, security-obsessed experience of air travel. He forced the system to adapt, closing the door behind him. For the FBI agents who worked the case, it was a career-long shadow. Some became convinced of one theory, others of another. They grew old with the file. They interviewed dying suspects and chased leads that led to rusted car parts in swamps. The 2008 recession brought a surge of new tips as people speculated that the still missing money might be hidden in their foreclosed homes. Each lead had to be run down. The agents were keepers of the facts, often frustrated by the public's romanticization of a federal crime. They saw the crime scene photos and the forensic reports, not the charming legend. To them, it was always an active case until it wasn't. In 2016, when the FBI relocated the case to its inactive vault, it was a quiet, bureaucratic end to an iconic investigation. There was no press conference, no definitive announcement. It was a recognition of reality. The likelihood of a conclusive resolution had diminished to near zero. Any surviving witnesses were in their 70s or 80s. The forest had reclaimed whatever might have been left. The money, except for those 290 bills, had seemingly dematerialized. The move was a form of closure for the Bureau, but not for the public. The mystery was now officially eternal. What is the lasting power of this story? It endures because it is a perfect mystery on multiple levels. It is a howdunit, a whodunit, and a what happened after puzzle all in one. The mechanics of the crime are fascinating in their precision. The identity of the man is a blank canvas onto which people can project their own ideas of who he might have been: a disgruntled vet, a brilliant engineer, a down-on-his-luck father. And the ultimate question of his fate is the greatest cliffhanger of all. Did he die a brutal death in the pines, or did he walk out of the woods, buy a car with cash, and start a new life? The absence of an answer is the answer. It allows for both possibilities to exist simultaneously. The emotional core of the D.B. Cooper story is not one of tragedy, like so many true crimes. It is a story of ambiguity. There is no grieving family seeking justice, at least not in the public eye. There is only the act itself, frozen in time. It exists in the realm of legend alongside stories of buried treasure and ghosts in the woods. The Columbia River, which yielded its small, rotting piece of the puzzle, continues to flow. The forests where he might have landed are still dark, deep, and silent, so we are left with the image of an open stairway in a stormy black sky, a man in a suit clutching a bag stepping backward into the void. He left behind a tie, a name that wasn't his, and a question that has echoed for over half a century. The case is closed, but the story is not over. It is retold every time someone looks at a $20 bill and wonders, every time an airplane passes overhead in the night, and every time the wind blows through the fir trees of the Pacific Northwest. D.B. Cooper is gone, but the mystery he left behind is a permanent passenger, forever in flight, forever just out of reach.